County Public Library in beautiful Georgetown, Kentucky. And today I'm here with my good friend and coworker, Mary Lou. We're going to be having a conversation about World War II, mostly fiction, but we've got a lot of nonfiction to talk about too.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll have a really good discussion.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Jessica is letting me do this because I love historical fiction is my favorite, and I love World War II fiction.
Oh, me too.
It's just I'm very passionate about
Yeah,
this. So the big thing is like just give me a T, like merely shut up if I talk too much. Okay, okay. I don't want to bore anybody.
I know we've got a lot to say on this topic, and there's so much.
There's a lot, and it's
World War
good
II
stuff,
fiction.
and it's good stuff.
It's very, very good stuff. I'm going to start with probably one of my favorites out of the group that I've read. It's called The Lilac Girls.
And I'm just going to give an amen to that book. I love that book.
2 thumbs up from
Yes.
Mary Lou and Jessica. It's by Martha Hall Kelly, and it describes the war life of 3 women that are. One of them is in America. She's a wealthy, kind of a socialite that works for the Paris consulate in the United States. And the other 2 women are in Europe. And one of them becomes a Nazi doctor. And you kind of get into, it's very difficult for me to think about what the steps were that would make a person who goes into the medical field actually become a Nazi doctor in a concentration camp. And they can only just give you maybe the barest.
Yeah, she was a woman, and there weren't many positions for women doctors at that time, and this
Right.
was a chance for her to
It was a chance
practice
for her,
medicine.
and she was ambitious. So she did become a doctor in a Nazi concentration camp, and one of the other story is about one of the women that ends up in the concentration camp that the Nazi doctor is working in. And so you get to see and experience 3 separate points of view. One from a woman in the United States who is desperately trying to help people in France that's been occupied by the Nazis and other areas in Europe. And then you get to hear about what goes on in the concentration camp Ravensbrück, which was for women only. And you get to see kind of the perspective of the Nazi doctor and the aftermath of what happens to all these people. So please read this.
Wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
Can't recommend it enough. In fact, everybody that I've talked to that's read it says
Yeah.
really, really, really good.
Yeah. Do you want me to go next?
Go.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about one. This book has been very popular. It's called The Nightingale, and it's written by Kristen Hanna. And getting ready for this, I went back and tried to find some interviews with authors and read a little bit of background behind the books. And Kristen Hanna said she wrote this book because she felt like the role of women in the resistance to the Nazis has been underplayed, and that most of their work was done quietly, less, kind of headline heroes, and she wanted to acknowledge, and that's kind of the theme in the books I'm going to talk about, is the role of women under these incredible circumstances. And this book follows 2 sisters in France, Vianne and Isabel, and their mother died when they were very young. Their father became an alcoholic, and he was overwhelmed with grief at the death of his wife, so he hired a woman to basically raise these girls, and she was a cold, unpleasant woman. The 2 sisters become estranged. Vianne marries her high school sweetheart, becomes a school teacher, has a daughter, lives this kind of, lovely life in the countryside of France. It goes into a lot of detail about her cooking and the food, always made me hungry, and it's great until her husband is drafted, and then the Nazis come in and occupy France. Her sister Isabel, who is younger, they're sort of estranged. She was very angry at Vianne that she ran off and got married and left her because Isabel was younger. Isabel's very rebellious, and she goes from boarding school, gets kicked out, to another boarding school, gets kicked out. And the last one she's kicked out, she comes and lands on her father's doorstep, who doesn't want her in Paris. And about this time, the Nazis are coming in, and Isabel joins the resistance. And it perfectly suits her rebellious personality to do this. Kristen Hanna was inspired. She was writing another book about World War II, but she learned about this person, this woman named André de Join. I haven't had French since high school, and I know I'm mangling the last name. Jong was this woman's name, and she developed this route over the Pyrenees Mountains and got out all of these pilots that were shot down, Allied pilots that were shot down by the Nazis, and they would find them out in the countryside and get them out of France over the mountains, and she led hundreds of pilots out of the country. So Hannah was inspired by that when she learned this woman's story. But beyond gets her own involvement out in the countryside with these Jewish families as they were rounded up. Some of them would sneak their children out so they wouldn't have to go to concentration camps. So she looks at the role of these women and this beautiful relationship between these two sisters. It's a long book, but you won't care because you won't put it down.
Okay, wow.
Great read.
It's on my list, definitely.
I must read it.
You've highly recommended it to me. Yeah, I can't wait. Can't wait. My next book is called, it's very popular now, so you probably have to be on the whole list, waiting list for this, but it's called The Forest of Vanishing Stars. It's by Kristen Harmel. And this book is about a woman. Well, she was about 2 years old when she was abducted from her wealthy German parents by an old woman that had some kind of spiritual, mystical insight. She was a very elderly woman. She had some kind of spiritual and mystic insight that she needed to do this. And so she kidnapped this little 2-year-old girl and took her out in the wilderness, basically, and raised her to be self-sufficient and to forage from the land, so nobody knew that they were out there, and they never came into contact with other human beings unless the elderly woman, they had to go into town for some reason, but she always tried to keep the little girl from contacting any other human beings. So she just basically raised her to be completely self-sufficient and always told her never get involved with human beings at all. But during the war, the elderly woman has died by then, and the little girl has become a young woman. And during the war, lots of people start escaping into the wilderness, especially Jewish people or people that were being rounded up for whatever reason by the Germans. And this young woman realizes that she has to help them survive.
I think I see where this is going.
Yes. She is leading them, and part of this is a true story. I mean, this young woman didn't actually exist, but the story of people escaping into the woods and trying to live off the land.
The movie Valkyrie, that's what that's about.
Okay.
Is that right? I got that right? No.
Not Valkyrie.
No, there's another one. It has a Daniel Craig in it, and it's about survival in the woods. I wish I could remember the name of it. Oh well, sorry.
Well,
anyway,
that's what this is. She literally meets people, and she starts having, becoming emotionally involved in the lives of the people that she is rescuing. So there's romance, there's heartbreak, there's things go on, and some little plot twists. But all in all, this is a very good read about World War II and describes things that did actually happen.
I had a really good friend in Chapel Hill whose father escaped a concentration camp and lived in the woods as part of the resistance army of escaped Jewish.
Yeah.
And he had me over for dinner one night to meet his father. He said, you can talk with them about it. I couldn't bring myself to ask him. I mean, tell me about your experience in the concentration camp. You just, you can't do it. It's just, but that was just it was just an honor to meet him. Just, golly day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is an honor to meet people that had.
Yeah.
I had a college professor that survived, and he was probably, he was a very, very huge influence on my life during my college years. So, yeah, definitely.
Okay, one more, here we go, Codename Verity. And this is, by the way, a YA teen novel written by Elizabeth, and I hope I'm saying her name right, Wein, W-E-I-N. And this is actually, it started off as a standalone novel, but she ended up making it into a series. She did a prequel and then 2 sequels. Again, this deals with the role of women in the resistance to the Nazis. And this book, you have got to, you've got to kind of let go as a reader of your need to control, because this book's going to confuse you at first. Okay. So it starts off with this girl, Queenie, who is very vivacious. She's wealthy. She's, as the reviewer said, she's got great nails, and she is in Nazi-occupied France, and she is crossing the street, and she looks the wrong way and steps out, and she gets stopped by the Nazis, who ask for her papers, which she doesn't have, so they imprison her. And she is the narrator of this novel, and she is being tortured in the Nazi, the prison in France, and she agrees to just spill all the beans to stop the torture and to get her clothes back. They've got her undressed and torturing her. And she's gonna write down her story, and they'll let her live as long as she writes her story, and this is her story. And then there's flashback to this girl, Maddie, who is a working class girl being raised by her grandparents. She's Jewish, living in northern England. Her grandfather was a mechanic and taught her how to be a mechanic. He buys her a motor scooter. She's out driving one day and sees a plane crash. And she goes over to help out, and the pilot is a woman. And she realizes, I want to learn how to be a pilot, so she learns how to fly. And then as the war goes on, she ends up becoming a clerk in the army, and then they find out that she can fly. And they use women pilots during the war to ferry planes that need to be repaired. But she meets this girl, Julie, who also was working with the army, and they become the best of friends. And they're out in the countryside picnicking one weekend, and they meet somebody who's part of the spy network in a pub, and he recruits them both to work with the spy network. Maddie, the Jewish girl, is going to fly the planes. Julie's going to become a spy, and Maddie's going to fly spies in and out of France at night. And one time when she's flying her plane, it gets shot down, and Julie's in that plane. So and then you've got this character who's kind of narrating the story. Well, who is she, and where does she fit in and all this? And you just got to wait to find all that out. There's a whole lot I can't say because I would give stuff away. This is one of my favorite all-time teen novels. It's just so good, and you need to read it twice.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you have to read it twice. Because the first time you're just going to get through it just to find out what happens, and the next time you got to read it again to see how they constructed this story and left all these clues. It's just a great masterpiece of a spy novel, but with a lot of real history in it.
Wow.
Codename Verity.
Okay, I'll put that one on my list too.
Yes.
This one, it's another brand new release called The Paris Library. It's by Janet Skeslien Charles. That's a hard one for me to say. Skeslien Charles. And I liked it because of the title, The Paris Library.
Yeah.
I mean, we love libraries, as you know, books. So this is about a Parisian woman who gets her dream job in the American Library in Paris. So she's working with a whole bunch of international people. There are people from different countries, different ages. She gets to know them all, and she gets to know the patrons. And then the Nazis occupy France, and everything starts to change. And so she, the library exists for the patrons. And when the Nazi occupiers say the Jewish people can't come in anymore and certain people can't come in, they start smuggling books out to their patrons. And
It's a whole new meaning to bookmobile librarians.
bookmobile librarians, yes.
Whoa.
And of course, there's some romance involved, but things in Paris during this time period just keep getting darker and darker and darker. And it talks about how some people do things that they probably wouldn't do ordinarily just to get by.
Yeah.
And what they're become willing to do.
When I was reading the Nightingale, it made it clear how much basically the German officers just took all the food. People were starving to death.
Yeah,
They were starving to death.
People were
Yeah.
starving to death.
Yeah.
And it talks about how people justified what was going on. You know, there are many different characters in this book besides the main character, Odile. So it does go a little bit into their mindset and how some people could justify driving, say, Jewish people out of their homes and making them disappear. It's quite frightening. And then there is another plot that goes on that takes place more in the present, in the 1980s, about when Odile is an old woman and she's living in Montana, I think, and how she gets involved in a teenage girl's life that's having some difficulties, whose mother has passed away and is having some difficulties. So you get to kind of learn. It takes most of the book for you to figure out why Odile has ended up in the United States in this far away, as far away from Paris Library as she can get. But it really is. What struck me about it was finding people that you thought were, you think when you're young that things are either right or wrong, and so you're either a good guy or a bad guy.
Right.
And
in some circumstances, there's no such thing as a good guy. You just can't be a 100% good guy.
Right.
You can't.
Right. So you're going to find some disappointment in some of the characters in here, but all in all, you've got to read it. It does describe a very fascinating time in history, and if you like libraries and you love books, definitely.
It's a good one, huh?
In World War II, definitely you've got to. And personal relationships that have ups and downs, like all of them do.
Like life.
Like life. Check this one out, definitely.
Before I get on to my next one, I do want to say why there's pictures here. This is a portrait of my father, who I love very much, and he served in World War II, as did Jessica's father.
Yeah.
And he was stationed in Germany. Towards the end of the war, he got a short leave to go over to France, and he had this portrait done on the Riviera, on these sidewalk sketch artists. So I thought it'd be really nice to have this portrait of him taken during this time here, during that time he was serving, and it's my favorite picture of my dad. So I wanted to let you know why that was there.
Yeah, I think it looks like a very good indicator of his personality.
He was a very tall, skinny guy. The next book I'm going to talk about is called Between Shades of Grey, although the title refers more to sometimes how bleak life can be, and you look for the cracks for the light. But this is a story that most of you do not know. I certainly didn't know this piece of history until I read this book. During this time period of World War II, the European allies, including and the United States, were allied with with Russia, with Soviet Union. We were unified in fighting against the Nazis, and therefore the United States and the Allies looked the other way about some of the atrocities that were being committed by Stalin. Part of the growing reach of the Soviet Union was they incorporated Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are right on the edge of the Baltic Sea, and they kind of incorporated that into the Soviet Union. And they, as they were doing this, they did what fascists do. They round up artists, teachers, doctors, prominent business people, all the military, all political leaders, and many of them they execute. What the Soviet Union did was they took the men and they shipped them off to, I believe, labor camps or concentration camps. And the women and children they sent up to Mongolia and Siberia to labor camps. And their goal was to create a genocide by separating the men and women. And they would all go off and either be worked to death or starved to death, and they wouldn't have any more children, and they'd be done. They'd be gone. A third of the population of Lithuania, the author is Lithuanian heritage, was killed under Stalin. 20 million people were killed by Stalin during this time period. This history about Lithuania, about the Baltic countries, was not revealed until 1990, 1991, kind of when the Cold War ended. Anybody that went to those camps that survived, and people survived, believe it or not.
They did. My college professor was one of them. He was an Estonian Jew.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Well, and they could not, they revealed anything about it, they were put back in the camps. So they kept quiet. And this is a fiction, but it's Sepetys, this was her first novel, and she spent a lot of time in Lithuania. She talked to her relatives. She spent years researching this novel to create one family's experience of going. The father was a professor. He was shipped off in one cattle car, and the mother and daughter were shipped off in another cattle car. They spent a year in Mongolia, and then they're sent finally up to Siberia, where it was even worse than it was in Mongolia. And they spent 10 years in that camp before they were finally released. And the author, the narrator, Lena, is an artist, and she draws and she writes, she keeps journals, and she keeps it all in a jar. And even when she got back home, they had to keep this stuff hidden so they wouldn't have to go back to the camps. A funny story about this book, it was released it's published in 2011, which happens to be the same year that another very famous novel came out called 50 Shades of Grey. And the two authors were on book tours at the same time. And people would come to the store because everybody wanted to read 50 Shades of Grey, right? Anyway, I didn't read it, but I heard everybody wanted to read it, right? But people would come to her at the bookstores on her book tour, and she would talk about the book, and they would say, "Well," because I would well, I thought this was erotica. I thought it was 50 Shades of Grey, but your book sounds really interesting. I think I'll buy it. So it actually really helped her book.
That's awesome.
And this is both of these are teen novels, but I will tell you that I think Codename Verity reads more like an adult novel because it's a very complicated plot, and it takes some willingness to really stick with this, and it's so rewarding after you read it. This book is one that I recommend middle school through adult because there's nothing in it that would be offensive to a younger reader, but it's very dark stuff. It's a lot of suffering, but it speaks to every audience, I would say from 12 up. I have book talked at middle schools, and certainly I would recommend it. It's had heavy adult readership, and it won a Morris Award for a debut author. So 50 Between Shades of Grey, a quote from the author, Ruta Sepetys. She said, I wrote this down, she said, "Read this book and then ask yourself, would I survive?" And I think as you read any of these
you will ask
these books from this history, you wonder, what would I have done in this circumstance?
Right.
So, Between Shades of Grey, love it.
Wow. Yeah, these are all that's going on the list too.
It gets long.
I know. we all have such huge lists of books we need to read. This one is a favorite. I've read this one several years ago.
So good.
I just love this
The
one.
audiobook is fabulous.
I can imagine. Do they
It
have
has
different voices?
Different actors do it, yeah.
So, the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Marianne Schaefer and Annie Barrows. I think this was the only novel of Marianne Schaefer. This was her novel.
It's aunt and niece that
Yes.
wrote it together.
They wrote it. I guess Marianne Schaefer wrote it mostly, and then her niece maybe finished it. They worked on it together.
Oh, neat.
But I love this because it reads as not as a continuous narration, but it's a series of letters, mostly between a writer named Juliet Ashton. She's a British writer, and she wrote humorous pieces during World War II in the novel. She's fictitious, of course, but she wrote in the story that we read here. She had written humorous pieces to kind of keep up the British spirit during the war, but she was afraid of becoming pigeonholed. She didn't want to do humorous pieces anymore. But everyone always thought of her as the writer of these humorous pieces. So she was looking for a good topic for a book, and she stumbled upon this Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society when one of her former books that she owned, she'd written her name and her address inside of it, ends up on the island of Guernsey, which is actually, although it is off the coast of England, it's actually closer to France. And it's a British territory, but the Nazis occupied it.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that the Nazis occupied parts of England.
They did. So Guernsey was entirely cut off from England during the war and was occupied by the Nazis. And the way that they formed the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society as a front for some activities that they were doing on Guernsey that
they're a little resistance.
They're a little resistance. Yes, they had food and they had a little party one night, and they shared it amongst themselves, and they weren't supposed to have this food. I guess it was a pig that they'd slaughtered, and they were out past curfew. So when they were all stumbling home after this party, the Nazis found some of them, and one of them was a really quick thinker and said, well, we were having our literary society.
They were reading gardening books, weren't they? Isn't that what they told the Nazis?
Yes,
yeah.
Because that's what she happened to have on her shelf, the woman that were the... Anyways, so our writer, of course this is happening shortly after World War II, so there isn't, she doesn't have a telephone anymore because her flat had been bombed during the war, so she's living somewhere temporarily, and she's just conversing by writing to people. And this novel is actually a series of letters between the writer and her publisher, between the writer and her best friend, and between the writer and a bunch of characters that were in the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And so during these letters, she's getting the story of what went on during the war on their island. And if you love eccentric British people like I do, you've got to read this.
And that's not even my cup of tea, but I love that book.
Yes,
I love that book.
You get to know every single personality in these letters, and I just love it.
And there's a movie on Netflix about it, made from the book, and it's quite good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you must read it. You must read it.
Well, this is my last one, and this is nonfiction, and this is called Bomb. This is also another YA book, but it's written by Steve Sheinkin, who is a prolific author of nonfiction for young people, and his stuff I recommend it to adults all the time. He writes, it's not short, but it's not like reading an academic tome either. This book is about the creation of the atomic bomb. And it almost reads like a thriller. You know, I couldn't put it down. And I think it's very fascinating that the race that the United States knew that the Germans were working on an atomic bomb, and there was a race to see who could create it first, because they felt like that was going to determine the outcome of the war. So he tells all the background, the science, all the hubbub around trying to this competition to do this, and the reaction of the scientists who created the bomb after the bombs were dropped in Japan. Like literally, when they saw what happened, some of the scientists were throwing up out in the yard, because they were so horrified. And they, I think the thing that was most poignant, I'm going to tell you the end, is when one of the scientists went to see the president after the war and begged him to get rid of all of the nuclear weapons. They felt they should never be used again. And the president threw them out. Just, don't ever let that person in my office again.
Wow.
It's really sad. But the other thing that I think was really interesting that I learned from this book, is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to be quiet, is that the American scientists, I think this is really important, and I'm going to tell you this even though it's the end of the book. American scientists are the ones that gave the Soviet Union the information on how to make the atomic bomb. They secreted it to the Soviet Union because they thought it was too dangerous for one country to have the atomic bomb. So and this is when the United States and the Soviet Union were still allied, and they slipped them this information. And it took years for the American government to figure out who did it. They knew it had been done, but they didn't know who did it. And that's what prompted the McCarthy witch hunts.
Wow.
Because they knew somebody had done that, but they didn't know who.
Wow.
So I learned a lot reading this fabulous book. And Steve Sheinkin, if you ever see his name on a book, pick it up and read it. He writes about all kinds of things. But his stuff is just so informative and rich, but it reads like a good story. He really weaves a lot of human interest into his books.
Wow.
Bomb by Steve Sheinkin.
That's one on my list too.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, well I've got a few more books that I want to talk about, so I'm going to try to go really fast because I know we're running along here. The Test Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris. This is another really, really super good book, and it describes what happens in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. And it's a Jewish man who's very educated, speaks many languages, and when he is rounded up and taken to the concentration camps, they decide, because he speaks so many languages, that he can be the one to tattoo the people that the Nazis have rounded up in these camps. And it's basically how he survives in the camp and how he helps other prisoners survive. Read it and learn what happened. It's quite a story. This is also actually a true story, and this did happen. So definitely you need to read it. You need to read it to find out what happened. Okay, this is the one that I'm reading now. It's called Eternal by Lisa Scottoline, and it's a brand new.
Is that how you pronounce her name?
That's how you pronounce her name. Scottoline.
Thank you. So I embarrassed myself in front of patrons.
This is a great book. It's full of all kinds of details, and it takes place in Italy, so it's another perspective on the war. And it's during the rise of Mussolini, and three people, young friends that grow up together, Marco, Sandro, and Elisabetta. They're all best friends, and the two guys just both decide that they are really in love with Elisabetta. And even though they're best friends, they're rivals for love. So
that never turns out well.
It never turns out well. And also, did I mention that Sandro is Jewish? So that adds a complication. There was a very vibrant Jewish population in Italy, and his family had been there for literally generations, like hundreds of years. And so what happens during World War II, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse for all of these people, and they have to decide where their loyalties lie, because Marco in this book is a member of the fascist party, Mussolini's party. And it was at that time in Italy, when Mussolini was in power, almost everybody had to be a member of the party. I mean, it was like Mussolini, and because he was almost considered, I don't want to say a god, but he was considered infallible.
Okay.
And so you had to follow him because he was the guy to follow. And you just got to read the book to find out what happens.
Okay.
Lisa Scottoline, Eternal. It's find out.
And you're liking it?
I'm liking it. It's got a lot of detail about the what life was like in Italy during the war, which is a perspective that we don't normally get. And how people came to do the things that they did and decide where their loyalties were. So, and of course you want to find out what happens to the three characters, because they're all good people, and you just end up caring about them and their families. So definitely read this. It's very popular right now, so you might have to be on the hold list, but I highly recommend it. Eternal by Lisa Scottolini. And I'm going to talk just a brief amount of time about nonfiction that we have on World War II, because we have a huge section of nonfiction that involves World War II. One of my all-time favorites, this is in the adult graphic novel section. It's called They Called Us Enemy. It's by George Takei. And it describes how the United States actually rounded up people of Japanese descent and put them into
Concentration camps.
Well, they were they were concentration camps. The people were not, they weren't tortured, but they were behind barbed wire, and guards were watching them.
And they lost everything.
They lost everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had to leave their homes and their personal possessions, and you know, they never got that back. And some of them were forced to renounce their citizenship to the United States, even though they'd been born here. And it just talks about what life was like in the camps, and definitely a perspective that every American needs to read. So
Really important part of our history that we don't think about very much.
Right. But George Takei, They Called Us Enemy. You must read it. If you're more into the actual fighting, another graphic novel in the adult section is Bombing Nazi Germany. It describes how they did it and how different techniques of bombing came to be used. So definitely look at that one.
Oh,
Mouse. This is a harsh one. This is in the adult graphic novel section because it's a bit harsh for children. But this describes.
It's often read in high school, though. It is.
Yeah. It's another look at the Nazi concentration camps, where and what happens in them. And then
the memoirist, I mean, the person that wrote it is based on his father's and mother's experience in the concentration camps.
Yes, it is. And then how that affected their later family life, which of course it did hugely. So Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Okay, if you're interested in the Paris Library fiction book, you'll be interested in this, A Train in Winter. This is all about the extraordinary story of women, friendship, and resistance in occupied France. So check that out. This will describe some of what went on there.
Verity.
Yeah. And Ravensbrück, Life and Death in Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women, which is discussed in the Lilac Girls. This is if you like the Lilac Girls fiction, this is the factual story of that concentration camp, Ravensbrück, that they talk about in that novel. So I highly recommend it. And check out all of our World War II fiction and nonfiction online.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah,
we could have done a week of book talks on this.
And we've also got video documentaries here at the library. So definitely check those out if you're interested in World War II. Yeah. Well, thank you for being on the show, Mary Lou.
I enjoyed it, every minute of it.
Okay.
I love talking about this.
Me too.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.